And today is probably one of my favorite talks because it's close to my heart, and it has to do with the how we even know that the Quran that we have in our hands that we use today. How do we even know that it is the book that they claim, the Muslims claim, that was revealed to Muhammad between 610 and 632? How do we know that the Quran we have in today goes back that far, 1400 years? Can we actually go in and investigate that? Because the claims they make, they're going to continue to make. And I think this is the difficulty for so many of us. We don't know how to answer those kind of claims because there are so little has been done on the manuscript evidence. Now, I'm just going to put my camera over here. If you look over here to my right, you will see I have some of the earliest manuscripts. Here is the Topkapi. Right below it is the Ma'il, and below that is the Petropolitanus. I will be going into these three in the talk today. I also have the St. Petersburg manuscript. These ones are actually life-size, so they're very, very heavy. That's why I don't want to pick them up right now. We will do that later on in this talk. But these are the manuscripts that we're going to be talking about today. These are the claims and the counterclaims. And what I want to do is unpack those claims. I want to go back and see what kind of research is being done. And I also want to debunk many of what the Muslims have been saying about their manuscripts. And they pretty much can say anything they want because nobody has done the research. And that's what you're going to find out as we go through these different manuscripts. So let's go ahead and let's get right into it. And I'll go ahead and share screen so we can follow and I don't go ranting off on other tangents. So let's put this to here. And what we want to ask are, where are these manuscripts? How old are they? And how different are they? Those are the three areas I'm going to be investigating. When we talk about preservation and about the Quranic preservation, Muslims not only have to make this claim, that they have to support it because the Quran itself makes these claims. And the 6 areas, remember I started with 4 back a few weeks ago. Now I've gone up to 6 different claims that I'm going to be working with today. The first one is they always say, and you've heard me say it many times before, that they claim that the Quran is eternal, that it's preserved on eternal tablets. That's in chapter 85, verse 22 of the Quran. So the Quran makes that claim for itself. They're just mimicking what the Quran says. Secondly, that it was sent down to a man named Muhammad between 610 and 632. That's the claim they make. But it's also in the traditions. Al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 509. We're going to talk more about that later in this talk. Number 3, that it was completed at the time of Uthman. That's also in Al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 510. So he was the one that completed it in its written form. He was the one that created the first codex. That's the canon that they talk about. And then number 4, that since that time, since the time of the canon, since the time of the recension of Uthman in 652 up till today, it has not changed. There has not been one word, there has not been one letter that has changed. This is what Yusuf Qadi has said for many years. This is what Shabir Ali continues to say. Now Yusuf Qadi, as we saw yesterday, possibly he'll be going off of social media because of the disastrous interview that he had back on June 9th, actually exactly, June 8th, exactly 4 months ago today. That if you make that type of claim, you're going to have to support it. And the difficulty is the Quran makes that claim. It makes it in chapter 10, verse 15, and then at chapter 18, verse 27. So if the Quran says that it cannot be changed, then Muslims have no other option but to support that. They can't go right or left. The difficulty is how they're couching it. By saying no word and no letter has changed, by putting it up on such a high pedestal, the higher you put it up, the easier it is to fall, and the farther you fall, as we're now finding in the last 4 months. Nonetheless, they still continue to make that claim. I don't know where Yusuf Qadi today, where he would go with that no words, no letters. I don't know if he would say that now in October of 2020, after the interview that he had in June. We'll see. I'm waiting to see if he is still making those kind of statements in a public sphere, in the public forum. Maybe that's why he's getting off the public forum. We'll see. Now, the 5th claim is that it is guarded. The reason why it's unchanged, the reason why it has no differences, why there is no word or letter that has changed, is because Allah guards it. And that's in chapter 15, verse 9. Since al-Kharajat, it is above any human intervention. Basically what they're saying is no human has touched this book. No human has touched this book. Because once you touch the book, once you show that humans have touched it, once you show that there is any type of changes or manipulations, accretions or deletions or any type of corruption, you are now admitting that Allah cannot guard his word. And that is anathema. Theologically speaking, and you can see from a whole approach of authority, that stands against everything Islam believes. So that's why they have to make this support for it. That's why they dare not admit that there is a problem with its preservation. And then sixthly, that the Quran was finally canonized in 1924, that the one that we have today, the Quran that we use today, this one here, the one that I've been showing up and I've been putting up week after week after week, this Quran was canonized in 1924. And therefore that is the derivation that we use today. That has never changed in 1400 years and is exactly the same that exists in heaven. So there are the three verses. I should have had them up there as I was going through them. You can read them. You have them in your own Qurans. 10:15, it is not for me to change it on my own accord. Verily, I fear if I were to disobey my Lord, the torment of the great day will be upon me. 18:27 says, and recite what has been revealed to you, referring to Muhammad, none can change his words. None can change any words of the Quran. And then chapter 15, verse 9, we will guard it. We referring to Allah in the plural form. So we will guard it from corruption. There it is in the Quran. We don't make that claim as Christians. We would be very careful not to make those 6 claims. We know the Bible was created. We know it was not sent down to just anyone. We know that it was written by men and that when they wrote it, they had a superintendence of the Holy Spirit so that what they wrote, God wanted written. That's why we have that idea of inspiration on the text itself. But we would not say that this was created or written in tablets in heaven. We would never make that kind of claim about the Bible. We even know the authors of many of the books, and that's why we put their names on the books. So can you see, since we don't make that claim, we don't have to defend those claims. Number 3, we would say it was complete in its original form, but we don't have any of the original manuscripts. We're the first to admit that. We're quite transparent about it. So we would say it is complete. That's probably the only part, the only section that we would agree with them. And number 4, that the Bible has been changed. We know it has. We know where they are, and we also show the reader where they are. Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20. John chapter 7, verse 53 to John chapter 8, verse 11. The woman caught in adultery. These are verses that are not in the earliest Greek manuscripts, and so therefore we say possibly they were added at a later date. We just don't know, since we don't have the original manuscripts. Neither do the Muslims, as we're going to find out. So certainly there have been some changes, but we keep them in there because there's nothing in any of those roughly 40 verses that changes any doctrine or any creed. So what is my remit today? Well, I can't critique the uncreatedness of the Quran or sent down, since I don't live in the 7th century and I have no idea about eternality. But I can critique complete, unchanged, guarded, and canonized. And those are the 4 areas I am going to talk about today. And those are the areas that we will really delve into. Whether the Quran is complete, whether it has ever changed, whether God really has guarded it, whether there's any human intervention, and what do we know about the canonical issue? What can we talk about? Which Quran are we referring to? Thus, what I would like to find out, and this is what I'll say from the get-go, if Muslims can make the claim they have about those 6 areas, then I want to see them produce one Quran, a complete Quran, from the mid-7th century. When I say complete, I mean all 114 surahs. I don't want 2 surahs here and 2 surahs there, or one fragment here and another fragment there. I don't even want 43% of the Quran. I don't want 53% of the Quran. I don't even want 90% of the Quran. I want 100% of the Quran from the 7th century. That's what they're claiming. That's what they're saying. That's what I'm demanding. And that's what we should all be demanding. When a Muslim makes these claims about preservation, when they're saying that it can be traced all the way back 1400 years, when they say that it is perfectly preserved all the way back to Uthman, hold them to that and say, fine, give me one Quran, 114 surahs from the mid-7th century, 652, that is unchanged, and that this canonical text, this canon that you have here, is exactly like that Quran. Show me that this, and I'm not talking about the dots and vowels. I know the dots and vowels were added at a later time in the 8th and 9th century. I'm talking about the razm. I'm talking about the skeletal text. I'm talking about the consonantal text. This part that's here in the margin over here. I don't know if you can see this, okay? I want to look at the Arabic. I want to look at the Arabic letters. And I want Muslims to start producing that because they claim it, and we never hold them accountable to it. We've got to hold them accountable to it, folks. You've got to shut them down in these discussions because until you do, they're going to make these claims and people are going to believe them and they're going to walk away with the understanding, their understanding, that there's no other book like the Quran. It is second to none as far as authority, as far as credibility, as far as authenticity. So that's my remit today. Let's see if we can get through it. There's an awful lot too, so I need to keep going. I'm going to look at 6 areas. We're going to look at the 2 compilations of the Quran. Then we're going to move into the 6 earliest Quranic manuscripts. From there, we'll move into the 2 layers of the Sana'a palimpsest. We'll certainly talk about the 2 Birmingham folios and the problems with radiocarbon 14. Then we'll head into the 4,000 early consonantal variants from Dan Brubaker's research and come up with the 63 earliest extant fragments that Muslims claim exist prior to 719 AD. And after that, we'll then come to some conclusions. So let's start with the very first one, and let's start with the 2 compilations of the Quran. What I mean by the 2 compilations is, of course, the Abu Bakr's Quran and Uthman's Quran. Those are the 2 compilations, one in 632, the other in 652. But where do we get the story about these compilations? Where do we get the story about Abu Bakr? Where do we get the story about the Yamama battle and the fact that Zayd ibn Thabit had to take what was left over from those who survived and put together that first codex, that first recension, the Abu Bakr's recension? Where do we get that story from? Let's put a timeline out and let's see. Because most Muslims, when you talk to them about this, they're assuming that this is coming from eyewitnesses. This is coming from people who were writing at the time that either Abu Bakr lived or Uthman lived, but that is not the case. Look at this timeline here. So let's start, much like we did before. The author for that story is al-Bukhari. So Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 509 and hadith number 510 are the 2 references where we understand and where we find out about how the Quran was put together, how it was formulated. And in al-Bukhari, you'll see that whenever I talk to Muslims, now some, the more educated, will know where he lived, but the vast majority assume that al-Bukhari got it from the eyewitnesses, that what he was writing, that the isnad only goes back 1 generation, that he must be up there, he was from the 7th century. I've heard Muslims even say that he was a good friend. He was one of the companions of the Prophet himself. So let's look at the timeline. Muhammad dies in 632, okay? Could be disputed. We're not going to do it right now. The Quran then was compiled in 652 by Uthman. That's what they claim. That's what Muslims claim. But look at where al-Bukhari dies in 870. So he wrote between 850 and 870 his hadith, Sahih Bukhari. That's 218 years after Uthman and 238, almost 240 years after Muhammad. And that's the problem. And that's what Muslims are not looking at, and they're not aware of it. That everything we know about what the Quran is, how it was created, where it was created, when it was created, who is its author, all these stories upon stories, litany of stories, are 240 years too late. They're way over here in the 9th century. 9th century, not in the 7th century, where they should belong. And we need to make sure Muslims see that. That's why I like to put timelines up there, because Muslims are not aware of what they're trusting. Everything they're dependent on is 200 years too late. So let's continue and let's get right into it. So let's look at that. Here is Sahih Bukhari. This is what he says. I'm not going to read the whole thing there. You can see it on the right there. It's in Arabic. Then you have the English translation. I'm just going to summarize what it's saying here. But this is the reference to the time of Abu Bakr. So Muhammad is dead now. This is about a year to 2 years later. They've had this big battle in Yamama. And about 70 of those who had recited the Quran died in the Battle of Yamama. And because they had died, there was a crisis. And they were fearful that the Quran would be lost, because much of the Quran was in their heads, had been memorized. It had not yet been written down. Very clear, it had not been written down. And that's why if these memorizers, those who had memorized the Quran, were dying off in such large numbers, 70 in this case, then you can see that this created a crisis for Abu Bakr and Umar. So they call on Zayd ibn Thabit, and they come into the throne room, and they ask him to write the Quran down. Write that from the memory of the companions and from bones, stones, and pieces of bark, things like that. At first, he refuses, and he says, no, I don't want to do this. And they said, it's a good thing if you do this. They said, okay, but how can I do something the Prophet didn't even do? In 22 years, he never wrote the Quran down. So how can I do something that he didn't do? He's asking a very legitimate question. They said, because you're his secretary. For goodness sakes, what do secretaries do? They write things down that their employers tell them to. So he finally agrees to do so. And he writes it down, and he gives it to Abu Bakr, who then gives it to Umar, who then gives it to his daughter named Hafsa, who used to be one of the wives of Muhammad. And she puts it under her bed. Now, it doesn't say that here. We just know this from the later traditions, that that's where she kept it. She put it under her bed for 20 years. Okay, now let's jump to the next hadith. Right after 509 comes 510. And that one then picks up the story 20 years later. So now we're in the time of Uthman. Abu Bakr has died. Umar has been killed. Uthman now is on the throne, and he is the caliph, and he is there in Medina. He sends up his soldiers up to a battle way up in Azerbaijan. And as they're up there in Azerbaijan, they hear other Muslims who are reciting the Quran differently than they recited there in Medina. And they hear it coming out of Iraq, and they hear it coming out of Syria. And they get really upset. And Hudayfa, who is the leader of the Medinites who are up there, he comes back to Medina. He's infuriated. He actually went to blows against those in Iraq and Syria who were fighting alongside them because they were reciting the Quran differently than what he knew it and had him memorized it. Comes back down to Medina, confronts Uthman and says, we've got to do something. We cannot have many different Qurans like the Christians have many different Bibles and the Jews. We must have just one Quran. And so Uthman agrees. Okay, let's just have one Quran. And so he says, get Zayd ibn Thabit, the same guy that wrote the first one there 20 years earlier, bring him up. And then I'm going to give you 3 men. And these are Zubair, Alas, and Ibn Hisham. Who are these 3 guys that he gives to Zayd ibn Thabit? Well, now we find out that they're his son-in-laws. They're the son-in-laws of Uthman, which means they have no expertise. These are not scholars. They're nothing more than part of the family. So he gives them, I guess, to make sure that Zayd ibn Thabit doesn't do anything that goes against the family name. Whatever the reason, we know that these other 3 really are not scholars. They're nothing more than men who have married the daughters of Uthman. So the 4 of them are given the responsibility to write the Quran in the Qurayshi dialect. The Qurayshi dialect. What's the Qurayshi dialect? We'd love to know, because we can't find this Qurayshi dialect. There is no dialect called Qurayshi in the 7th century. The Quran that we have today, the Arabic that we find in this right here, this Arabic, according to Al-Jalad, in his seminal work that he did in 2018, just 2 years ago, has pretty well delineated that the Quran, the Arabic that's in the Quran, is not from the central part of Arabia. It is certainly not Qurayshi. It is actually Aramaic, Nabatean Aramaic, from way up in Jordan. Ooh, wait a minute, Jordan, isn't that where Petra is? Good on you. So you can see the Arabic that we have here, the Tar Marbuta, the Tanween, these are not part of any Arabic that existed down in Central Arabia. In fact, the Arabic that existed in Central Arabia would be Sabaic Arabic, which is interesting because Sabaic Arabic does have dots and does have vowels. Had they used Sabaic Arabic, they would have had this problem with all the Qira'at. They would have never had this problem with all the dots and vowels. We're going to talk more about that next week, so I don't want to get into much further. But anyway, she says to write it in this Qurayshi dialect, this imaginary dialect that supposedly is the dialect that Muhammad would have spoken. It's the dialect that they would have used there in Mecca and Medina. And that suggests, therefore, that this is the dialect that's in that tablet that's up there in heaven. And therefore, Allah only reads Qurayshi dialect, the Qurayshi dialect. We're going to get into that, but can you see? What for today, though, let's just talk about that idea. So he brings it, puts it into one dialect, hands this codex to Uthman, who then makes 5 copies and sends them to 5 provinces. And then he takes all the other ones that disagree with this Qurayshi dialect, takes all of them, and he burns them, destroys them. So he takes all the Iraqi ones, all the Syrian ones, anything from Damascus, anything from Kufa, anything from Basra, and he destroys them, burns them up. So there is no trace of any other Qurans. That's according to Al-Bukhari that we're reading right there. Okay, let's put this on a timeline. You remember we talked about this in the last week. So we begin with one Quran, right? We begin with one Quran. That's the one that was revealed to Muhammad. And that's the one Quran that existed when he died. However, we're also told that Jibril comes up to him and actually they have a discussion. Muhammad says, there are so many people who don't understand Qureshi. The Qureshi Dialect, could you reveal it in other ways? So he reveals it in 6 other ways. So now there are 7 readings, or 7 different Qurans, 7 different ways of reading it by the time he dies in 632. So now we have 7 Qurans, right? But then Uthman comes along and he says, no, we don't like these other readings. I'm going to destroy them, burn them. And so he brings it back to 1. And that's the Qureshi dialect, all right? So by 652 now, it's back to 1 again. Are you following me? We did this last week, so I don't think this should be new to you. But they then sends that Qureshi dialect to 5 cities. He once remains there in Yathrib, which is Medina. One was sent down to Mecca. One was sent to Basra. The other was sent to Kufa, just not too far from Baghdad, and one was sent to Damascus. So 2 in Iraq, 1 in Syria. And what did he do? He made sure that those that were already there were destroyed, and he replaced them with the Qureshi dialect. So that's why they're all green again. So now you have 5 cities now have this Quran in just 1 dialect, the Qureshi dialect, in all 5 cities. And now we're back to 1 Quran. Everything's safe and fine, except we get these traditions that speak about other Qurans. And here's one up in Damascus that became popular, that was created by one of the companions of the Prophet named Ubay ibn Ka'b. And his Quran up in Damascus, way up there in Syria, had 116 surahs, not 114 like we have today. Another one appears there in Kufa or Baghdad, which is by Ibn Masud, which is even considered to be even better. And it is much better than Zayd ibn Thabit's, because when Zayd ibn Thabit was just a little lad, Ibn Masud had already memorized the Quran. So his is 111 surahs. Some say 110, some say 112, but it's not 114. So you can see we're talking about different Qurans here. And take a look at where they are. They're way up in Syria and they're way up in Iraq. And then a third one comes out that is very popular in Basra, and that's written by Ibn Musa. It does have 114 surahs. Is it the same 114? Is it the same Quran of the Quraysh Quran? Who knows? We can't find them. We just know about them, references to them. But I'm going to say something about one of them, Ibn Masud, a little bit later in this lecture. And then, of course, then you have Zayd ibn Thabit, who's there in Mecca. Oh, no, that's right. Not red. It is green. Make sure it's green. So there you have it. You have, though we are told in Al-Bukhari that the Qureshi dialect has been sent to these 5 cities, so they are only reading the Qureshi dialect. That's what we're told. We then hear all about these other manuscripts that appear. Ubay ibn Ka'b's, Ibn Masud's, Ibn Musa. Those are the 3 main ones. Listen, there's many more than that. And Dr. Arthur Jeffrey, when he did a research just looking at the traditions on these other codices that existed, he found 15,000 differences between those codices and the Quran that supposedly that we have today. So let's continue on and let's ask some questions. Why did Abu Bakr, why did he not make copies? When he had that first one, why did he just make 1 copy and give it to Hafsa, who put it under her bed? Isn't that a lousy place to keep the only copy of the Quran? Wouldn't it have made an awful lot more sense to make copies immediately, like what Uthman did later, and send them out to all the cities so there would not be a multiplicity of different Qurans? Second question. Muslims say that thousands died at the Battle of Yamamah. That's why they had to quickly write it down. That's not the case. According to traditions, only 70 of the Hafiz, those who had memorized the Quran, died in that battle. Now, doesn't this prove that there was very few who actually knew the Quran? If only 70 had died and this caused the crisis, then that suggests to me that very few had memorized the Quran. And if 70 is going to cause a crisis, then how many more actually memorized the Quran? And also, if 70 were killed, what happened to their memories? Are there parts of the Quran that died with them? Because they didn't all memorize the same thing, and they all did not have the same Quran, as we're going to find out. I mean, you can already see, I've just in the last slide, I showed you there were actually 3 different Qurans that we know of that are up in Iraq and Damascus that do not at all equate with the Quran that was finally canonized there in Medina. Also, doesn't this moreover prove that the memorization was not good enough to preserve the Quran, as Muslims constantly claim today? They always say we don't have to worry about the manuscripts, we don't have to worry about any writing. It was memorized. No, well, that wasn't good enough for Abu Bakr. It certainly wasn't good enough for Uthman. The fact that memorization was not good enough, that it forced them to have to write it down, suggests to me very clearly that they did not have it memorized, or if they did, it was not at all authoritative enough. Number three, how could there be dialectical differences in the mid-7th century? Remember, as I said before, and I said with the Qur'an problem, you can't get dialectical differences in the Arabic script until you have dots and vowels. You have to have those 5 dots, and you have to have the 3 vowels, the dhamma, the kasra, and the fatha, plus the 5 dots. Until you have those, there is no way of reading the text any differently in a script form. And those dots and vowels did not exist in the 7th century. There were only 16 letters in the 7th century. They had to then up it to 28 letters by the 8th and 9th century by adding the dots and vowels. And then, of course, you have a whole multiplicity of ways of knowing of where to put those dots and which dots in what, over what letter or below what letter, and which vowels above or below the letters. So you can see that this would not make any sense to have dialectical differences or even a Qurayshi dialect there in the 7th century. But the reason why it is there is because it's written by al-Bukhari. Well, Bukhari is writing in the 9th century, between 850 and 870. So from his perspective, looking back on the 7th century, he assumed that this was because they needed a dialectical purification. They needed to eradicate the other dialects and only have one dialect, without thinking through that there were no dots and vowels to delineate that. Can you see a problem? This is an error built into al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 510. Now, number 4, why in the world did Uthman burn the other copies? Now, Shabirari, in his video of May 19th, he says, listen, the reason why he burned it is because these were different dialects, which were different recitations. Different recitations. Recitations are oral. Recitations are not scripted text. You don't burn orality. How can you burn someone's mouth? How can you burn unless you burn them completely? So you cannot burn a person. You have to burn a book. And it's the books that are born. If he's burning books, that means there's a scripted text. If it's a scripted text that is different, that means it has nothing to do with the dialectical differences. It has nothing to do with any Qurayshi or Kufan or Damascus dialect, because there is no scripted text that would accommodate a dialectical form, as I said earlier, in the 7th century. Until you have dots and vowels, there's nothing there to burn. You can't burn anything. And when you look at the earliest manuscripts, as we are going to look on today, they don't have any dots and vowels. Can you see a difficulty with this? And that's why it's fascinating when Shabir Ali says these are nothing more than dialectical differences. No, the fact that he burned them suggests to me pretty strongly that these had different scripts, completely different razm. Razm means skeletal text. These are consonantal letters. That means completely different words, which means completely different Qur'ans. Now, I would love to be able to see those Qur'ans. Too bad he burned them so we don't have them to compare with. But isn't that the case always with Islam? They always burn what they don't like, or destroy that which is a little bit puzzling, or in this case, damaging. Number 5, the fact that Zayd ibn Thabit came upon Surah 33:23 with one man, Khuzaimah ibn Thabit al-Ansari, proves that the Quran wasn't even complete in 632. Could there have been many other surahs that he missed? What about the material which was lost with those killed in the battle at Yawma in 632? 70 that were killed there. What about the Qurans that were also up there in Iraq and also in Syria? Did they have extra surahs? Looking at it, certainly they did, because we know Ubay ibn Ka'b had 116. We know Masud had 111. So you can see, with all that's coming in, it looks like that there's quite a multiplicity of different Qurans that were of different sizes, that had different words, and therefore different meanings. The 5 copies that were made for each province, where are they today? Where is there even one? We're talking only 1400 years ago. Couldn't they preserve even one? This question, take a look. Look at that map there. Where are the copies of the Quran sent to the 5 cities? Look at those 5 cities. Those 5 cities are still under Islamic control today. They've always been under Islamic control. For 1400 years, they've been under Islamic control. How can you tell me that if you send 5 copies to 5 cities, all in the Qurayshi dialect, that they have not been able to be retained in 1400 years? No, there have been no floods. I don't know of any fires. I don't know of any destruction of any libraries in any of those 5 cities in the last 1400 years. I'm not told that anybody has actually destroyed any Quran in any of those 5 cities. So what happened to those original 5 manuscripts? Where are they? 5 readers were sent with every one of those manuscripts. Why is it the readers could not preserve it? And why in the world? Is this just sheer ineptitude by the Muslims? So can you see this is fraught with difficulties. They're only 1400 years. Listen, we have the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, which are 1700 years old. They're in the British Library in the Vatican. The Alexandrinus, which is 1600 years old, they're also in the British Library. If we can preserve 3 metropolitan codices in a time of oppression, remember, there's been all kinds of oppression. These manuscripts have been manipulated and sent all over the place. They were found there in St. Catherine's Monastery, for heaven's sakes. And they've withstood 1400 years of Islamic oppression, and we still have them today. How is it that we can come up with 230 New Testaments before the 6th century, and Islam can't even come up with one of their greatest revelation? Their greatest revelation. 5 sent to 5 cities. And in 1400 years, they still not can show us one of these manuscripts, not one of them. All of these cities are still under Islamic control. Even one completed in 7th century copy would suffice. That's all I'm asking for, just one. And then what about all the Qur'ans that I have up there? All about my Qur'ans. Goodness sakes, what about then the almost 700 Qur'ans that begin to start appearing from 736 on up until 844, 9th century, were then canonized in 936 and then recanonized in 1388. And then recanonized again in 1429, and then recanonized yet another time in 1924. So folks, I mean, these are simple questions that we're asking. I'm not asking anything that's difficult, and Muslims should be able to answer these questions. You also need to ask these questions. You cannot tell me that there's 5 copies were sent to 5 different cities with the intention that nothing would change. They were sent there to preserve the text. Well, they've done a pretty lousy job if they can't even come up with one of them. Not even from Mecca and Medina do we have a manuscript that goes back to Uthman. Not one, not one. So let's look at the 6 earliest Quranic manuscripts. Let's get right into it. I just want to keep my check on time so that we don't go too far. By the way, this is iced tea. It's not beer. Everybody think I'm a beer drinker. I love beer, but I'm not drinking while I'm speaking. This is iced tea that we love here in America. I'm not asking you to love it. I know you British are sitting there gnarling your teeth and gnashing your teeth, excuse me, because we dare desecrate tea by not putting milk and sugar in it. Sugar, yes, not milk. Let's continue on. 6 earliest Quranic manuscripts. Now, these are the ones, and this section here is something that I introduced way back in 2014. These 6 manuscripts I held up facsimiles, or I held up pictures of facsimiles back in 2014 in my debate with Dr. Shabirati. So this is not new material, although we're finding out new things about him. And remember, for those of you who have seen that debate, that was on August 29th, there in Toronto. I talked about these 6 manuscripts, and Dr. Shabirati, considered to be one of the leading authorities on the Quran, could not and had not even looked at any of these, was not even aware of these 6 manuscripts, did not do any study on it, still hasn't done any study on them that I'm aware of. Yeah. So here we have a real problem, because if back in 2014, when I held them up and I showed them up, and that was, I think, the first time that the world had really seen them. I don't think anybody there, the scholars had known about them, but nobody outside of scholarship and academia had realized that there were not just 1, but 6 manuscripts, and that these 6 manuscripts were well documented. We know where they were. We know where they are preserved. We know where they lie, and that there had been this scholarly work done by these 2 Turkish scholars between 2002 and 2007. This was the first time that anybody heard it publicly, and that's why it went viral all over the world, and still is. And because of that, in some ways, we are way ahead of Islam, of the Muslim scholars, we being those in the West who are actually studying the manuscripts, the Orientalists. I use that word. I don't run away from it. So let me go through and unpack that. I'm not going to do an exhaustive review of any of these manuscripts for one very good reason. They would take 2 hours per manuscript just to unpack. And we don't have that kind of time. You can't, I don't want to spend too much time. Go and see my debate. It's 6 years old. It's still almost everything that I say there, I would still hold today, although we have gone ahead with what we now know about them. Now, here's the problem. I want to say there has been some research on these manuscripts, but very little research. Why is it we know so little about these manuscripts? Well, because this whole idea of researching manuscripts is absolutely anathema in Islam. Muslims do not do this. They just don't research manuscripts critically, for one very good reason. It's not very healthy to begin with. And secondly, they don't see any reason for it. So unlike the Bible, textual criticism is unknown in classical Islam. I don't know of any study or any real good books that have been written on textual criticism of the Quran. What they do and how they find Qurans, and the reason why they consider one Quran to be better than another, has more to do with isnad, and other than who did this come from, the name of the change of name from where this manuscript was derived, or whether or not it is a caliphal manuscript, or whether it comes from a certain family, or even where it comes from a certain place, like we saw with the Qira'ats. Remember the Qira'ats that we talked about last week? Qira'ats were chosen not because they looked at the text. Nobody even opened any of them. They didn't look at any of the words. They weren't even interested in the reading. They weren't even concerned with whether or not the text jived with that which the reader, from which they came from the same stable they came out of. They weren't even concerned with that. They wanted to know how many students they had. They wanted to know how popular they were. They wanted to know from which family they came from, or what city they came from, like the Warsh text. It came from Cairo, and it didn't come from Medina, and that's why they chose him. Fascinating. There's been no textual criticism done of any of these manuscripts. That's what we're doing. We're the first ones to do that. Those of us in the West. And there's a team that is actually getting together to do this. I can't say too much more about it because that's still in the works. But can you see, since this has not been done, there's very little known about these manuscripts, other than the fact that they're on display. And the one that the top copy, this one here, during Ramadan, they will put it on display every Ramadan there in the Topkapi Palace there in Istanbul, and they will show it to the world. But no one has ever really looked at it from the Topkapi Palace that I know of that has actually asked whether or not the words or the phrases or the sentences or even the surahs are exactly the same as others. It was these two Turkish scholars that were the first to do that. And they just did that between 2002 and 2007. That's this century. We're just talking about 18 to 12 years ago. So you can see the difficulty that we're dealing with. It's difficult to research manuscripts. Let's say that from the get-go. Old manuscripts are not preserved like we preserve biblical manuscripts. They are usually discarded. Many times they're housed in the domes of mosques, and they're kept there, and they're forgotten. That's why when they came across the Sana manuscript, the trove that they found there, when they were cleaning the dome and they opened up this trapdoor and hundreds of manuscripts fell to the ground, surprised everybody. Shouldn't have, because that's quite normal. That's when they were leafing through and they came across these Sana manuscripts that had no vowels and no dots, and they didn't know how to read them, and they realized these are really archaic, and that's why they flew the Germans in. Dr. Gerd Pwin, von Bothmer, and Dr. Olich, they flew them in to look at them and to actually try to see if they could decipher what they were saying. So that's the difficulty. Manuscripts are not preserved like we preserve biblical manuscripts. We hold them and we keep them in nicely aerated cases where there's no humidity permitted. We are very careful not to make sure that anybody touches them. And if you do, you have to have special gloves, and they completely they control the environment around every one of these manuscripts because they're fragile. Islam doesn't do that with their manuscripts, has never done that with their manuscripts. Now, they are starting to today, yes, today, because of the pressure coming in from the West to do just that. And usually if a manuscript starts to wear down or starts to get moth-eaten, or a lot of times it had to do with water. They got water damage. They would either burn them or they would store them away. And the problem is getting access to these manuscripts. This is something that Dr. Brubaker really showed me when I in my talks with him. He had the most difficult time getting into these manuscripts because many times they're in libraries, or they're in palaces, or they're in some cases they're in mosques, and you can't just walk into them. You can't go and look at them. And so you have to create a relationship with the person who actually is in control of them. And so he had to go to the libraries and to mosques, and he had to go and make relationships with every one of them. And that's why he was able then finally, because of all these relationships and going back and forth to St. Petersburg, to Turkey, going back to Cairo, going out to Sana'a in Yemen, going to these countries, into these cities, into these libraries, that he was able to make that relationship so that he could just simply film them, make pictures of them, and be able to look at the changes that have been done to the script. It's also a dangerous field. This is one of the only areas of research where you can lose your career quite quickly. It usually once you start investigating something that's critical like this, doors begin to close. We found this with not quite a few Western scholars. I remember, well, I'm not going to say too much because I have to be careful what I say here. I can't even tell you the stories that I know about scholars who have had doors closed on them. I'm not permitted to do that because they don't want this out in the public sphere. They don't, because they're still dependent on getting into those libraries, getting into those museums, getting into those schools, getting into those mosques so they can do their research on them. If they find their name is applied to what I'm saying, they could get those researches. That research could be shut down very quick. And it may cost you your lives. Look at what happened to John Wansbrough and Patricia Corona. Both of them, John Wansbrough at the School of Oriental African Studies, when he wrote Quranic Studies and Sectarian Milieu, those two books in the 1970s, he got death threats. And as a result of those death threats, he had to shut down his research. He moved to France and he stopped any more research on Islam. He went into tax laws, things like that, dull and boring subjects. But he had to, because he had this death threat over his head. When Dr. Patricia Corona, when she was at Oxford University and wrote Hagerism and followed that up with Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987, she got death threats. And as a result, she had to move from Oxford up to Cambridge. And that's where I met her. And I remember talking to her about this before I did my debate back in 1995. And I remember asking her, you know so much, you have such good material. She pretty much put my debate for me. She put it together, showed me all the 10 different questions I should ask, show me what I should say, what I shouldn't say, how I should say it better. And I finally turned to her and I said, why don't you do this debate? And she just smiled. She says, I can't do this. I have a chair to protect. I've already got a death threat. I dare not go into public. I just write books. You can. You have the freedom to do this. I don't have this type of freedom. She told me. That was back in 1995 when she told me that, 25 years ago. So this is a problem with research. What you find will shut doors, will bring down your careers, and may even kill you. And that's why so few people want to get into this area of research. And even yesterday I was on phone calls with two of world-renowned experts, and both of them do not want their names to be put into public. They will give me the material, they will tell me what they're finding, but they did not want their names to be publicized. And I'm saying here, since what area of research do you not publish people's name? Do you not give credit where credit is due? Why is it I cannot say about these guys and these gals? Why can I not talk about them? Why can I not lift them up and say, great work, look what you're doing, this is terrific, we need more of it? Because they know that if I were to use their names today in this broadcast, so that this will go up on YouTube, and that if this got out, they would lose not only their chairs, but they would also lose an awful lot of their future research, would go down the drain. So it's really rare. This is probably the only area of study that I know of that will shut down your career and maybe shut down your life, depending on what you find, unfortunately. So let's do a quick comparison between biblical manuscripts and Quranic manuscripts. On the left, you find biblical manuscripts. We have 5,300 Greek. I know some people will say it's up to 5,800. 10,000 Latin Vulgates, 9,300 other Latin. You put those together, just the manuscript evidence we have for the Bible, that's 24,000 manuscripts that we can look at. Huge amount. Over on the right, the Quranic manuscripts, 6 major manuscripts, and others like the St. Petersburg manuscript, the Doha manuscript, and others that are not as authoritative nor as early. Maybe possibly, according to what Dan Brubaker tells me, up to around maybe 10 other ones. So you're talking about at the most 16 to maybe possibly 20 lesser manuscripts. And that's the difficulty. That's the difficulty. They're just so few manuscripts, and nothing on the scale that we have in the biblical manuscripts. The biblical manuscripts are not even more plentiful. They're much better to look at. They're much better preserved. They're easier to read, and they're much more accessible. You can go into almost any of these manuscripts. Most of them are up online. You don't even have to go physically to see them. They're all in picture form, except for the Sana'a manuscript and a few others. We don't have anything that's comparable in the Quranic, on the Quranic side. We also, on top of that, from the manuscript evidence, we have 19,000, more than 19,000 translations in 11 different languages. We have 2,135 lectionaries from the 6th century. We have 86,000 early church fathers quotations. Over 36,000 of them predate the 4th century, predate the manuscript evidence, predate the Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus, and the Vaticanus. As I've said many times, when you just look at the Gospel of John, just by looking at the early church fathers quotations of the Gospel of John, you can recreate the entire Gospel of John except for 11 verses. Ooh, I love that. which means we can throw out all the manuscripts. Please don't. I want to preserve them. We can throw out all of the lectionaries. We don't need any of the translations. We don't need any of them. We can just go back to the early church fathers' quotations and reproduce almost all of the New Testament and the Gospel of John, the most important gospel when we're working with Muslims, the one that has the highest Christology, the one that zeroes in on the divinity of Jesus over and over again. That one we can recreate just by looking at these early church fathers' quotations from before the 4th century, before the Sinaiticus, before the Vaticanus, before the Alexandrinus, before any of the earliest manuscripts, and we can still reproduce the entire gospel except for 11 verses. That's how great a trove we have. That's the brilliant part of the fact that we pretty well know what our Bible is. Islam cannot make that. We're going to talk about the 63 fragments that the Muslims have pushed forward. They've just been pushing this forward in the last 2 years. These 63 fragments that they claim support the entire Quran, at least 96% of the Quran by the 1st century. That's how desperate they are. That's how desperate they are. My gosh, I'm so glad that in our biblical research, we don't have this kind of desperation. When you look at the canonical process, we know that the canonical process was not something that was done year after year after year after year over periods of hundreds of years. The canonical, we know that the canon was pretty well put together by the early church right within the very first centuries, and there was really only 5 criteria. Was it authoritative? Was the author confirmed by God? Was it truthful? Was it dynamic? And was it used? That's all that was needed to know which are the 27 books that were needed for the New Testament. When you look at the canonical problems that they have on the Quran, Shadi Nasr has done an amazing job of showing that there are actually 5 different periods of canonization. 5 different periods of canonization. They did not happen at once. The first canon was that by Uthman in 652. And then you have a second canon that was put together, and that's the Qur'an canon that by Ibn Mujahid in 936. That's 300 years later. And then on top of that, you then have another canon where the two transmitters for every one of the readers was then canonized by Al-Shatibi in 1388. And then on top of that, then you have another canon another one that comes in 1429 by Al-Jazari, who then adds another 3 readers and another 6 of the transmitters, so 9 to the 21 that were there from Ibn Mujahid and Al-Shatibi, and adds them in 1429. So that's 800 years later, they finally get the 30 Qurans, the 30 Qurans that are now canonical today. Now, if that isn't bad enough, Shadi Nasr then goes and said there's a 5th canon, and that's the 1924 canon, when they take the 30 and bring it down to 1. This guy right here, this little guy right here, this little blue. They bring him down to the little blue. And that was done in 1924, just 96 years ago. My goodness sakes, can you see? Thank goodness we don't have that problem with canonization. Our canonization happened almost at the very beginning, and it had nothing to do with caliphs or kings that were controlling it. In almost every case of Uthman ibn Mujahid, Al-Shatibi, Al-Jazari, and Al-Hafsa, they all had to do with caliphal control, authority sitting over top of it. Now, let's go into what the scholars say. So let's unpack and let's look at some of these manuscripts. We are now going to move into those 6 earliest extant Qurans, and I'm not going to do an extensive overview, probably because we just don't have the time. And as you're going to see, we're finding out some new research on some of them in just the last few days. So it's, goodness sakes, this is one of the fun things about historical criticism. It's always moving on. It's getting larger, and there are more people coming into the field. And because of that, what I say today will be out of date probably by even next week. To say nothing of what I said back in 2014 is already out of date today. So let's move on and see what we do know about these manuscripts. And we want to show you these 2 scholars, because these are the 2 scholars who actually took the time and the effort and the energy to look at the 6 major manuscripts. One, the name is Professor Dr. Ikmel Ihsanoglu, and he is a founding director of IRCISA, Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Conference Research Center. And so he is a person of repute there in Turkey. His patriot and probably the better scholar of the two is Dr. Tayyip Altıkulic, better known as a scholar, leading scholar in Quranic studies, ex-president of Turkish Religious Affairs and deputy in the Turkish Parliament. Both of these scholars are actually politicians as well as being scholars. I don't know why the two go hand in hand, but they do. They're in Turkey. And they were the ones who put together the consortium of the 6 manuscripts, and they came with their work, this one here called Al-Musaf al-Sharif. This is the work that they did, and it's, you need to read the first 83 pages, because the first 83 pages is the introduction, which goes in and explains what they found in all the 6 manuscripts. But I'll say more about this just in a bit. Dr. Ekmen al-Insan says this: we have none of Uthman's Musaf. This is the first thing he said. There is no such thing as an Uthmanic recension. Although Muslims have been claiming it, that the Topkapi, the Samarkand, the Ma'il, the Petropolitan, the Husseini, and the Sana are all Uthmanic. They claim that. He says these are nothing more than attributions. There is no such thing as an Uthmanic Musaf. They just don't exist. None exists. Nor do we have any copies from those Musafs. So we don't even have the next generation of manuscripts, he's saying. These Musafs date from the later Umayyad period. So all of these 6 are from the later Umayyad period, which goes, the Umayyads started in 661 and go to 749. So the later part, up to 749, we're talking about the 8th century. So in almost every case, they're saying these are all 8th century manuscripts, not 7th century. Altıkulic goes on and says there has been no serious scholarly work has been done on any of them. We're the first to do it, basically is what he's saying. Until we started our research in 2002 up to 2007, they finally put their research out in 2009. It was translated to English in 2013. I got it in 2014. 2014. And I was able then to use Dan Brubaker's research and then also their material to then unpack these 6 manuscripts for my debate in August of 2014. So no serious research. The fact that these are the first to actually research and actually look physically at these 6 manuscripts is telling right there. And that supports what I said earlier. No one is willing to research these manuscripts. But they are not Uthmanic, it says, nor are they even copies sent by him to any of those 5 copies that I talked about. So the most important is the Topkapi. That's the one that is considered to be really the king manuscript amongst all of them. Why? Because it is so complete. And here it is right here. This Musaf al-Sharif goes, the introduction is about all 6 manuscripts, but the entire Topkapi is right here. I've got it. So I've got the whole thing. It's kind of heavy, so I'm not going to hold it up too much. But you can see page after page. And so it's about 99% of the Quran, though there's so much water damage in many of the pages that some say there is as much as low as 78% that is readable. And you can see there are all kinds of damage to the manuscript. I'm not really showing it that close, unfortunately, because it's just too heavy to do it. But you can see there are difficulties. They didn't really keep this that well. If this is the best they've got, and they didn't keep it that well, that says something about either their view of manuscripts or the fact that they just were not in the mood to preserve them. So the Topkapi Musaf probably is dated to the early to mid 8th century. I'm going to dispute that with something I just heard yesterday. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and keep with the slide that we have here. Now, that you can see there on the picture there are parts of it that are so damaged that almost half the page is missing. And they have later diacritical marks that are added at a later date, and they're usually in a different color. That pretty much shows you that they're done. Those dots were added at a later period. Altıkulic says this about the Topkapi. It is dated to the second half of the 1st century AH. So AH is from 622 to 719. To the second half would be about 670 to 719. And the first half of the 2nd century. So really that would be from 719 up to 770. So anywhere between that period. So he's really saying, he's giving us a 100-year period, which is not really helpful. And this is the problem. They don't know how to date these manuscripts at all. They really don't know how to date them. But at least he's saying the second half, which would put it into the 8th century, and then the first half of the 2nd century, which would put it into the mid 8th century. Even though we would like to publish the sacred text as the Musaf of Caliph Uthman, he would like that, and we would like to say that this is Uthmanic. Our research indicated that it was neither the private Musaf of Caliph Uthman nor one of the Musafs he sent to the various centers, the 5 that he sent to those 5 cities, to Medina, Mecca, Basra, Kufa and to Damascus. His conclusions, there are deviations from the grammatical rules and spelling mistakes in the Musafs attributed to the Caliph Muhammad. In fact, he says there are 2,270 instances where there is a difference from the consonantal skeleton of the Fard Musaf. That's what he's come up with. He came up with 2,270. Now, again, he did a cursory look at it. He hasn't really done nearly the work that is being done now on the Topkapi, and that I'm going to say in just a bit, because what we now know is that there is much more than that. Here's what Keith Small did. He just gave an example of one of the differences. I'm going to give you some more later on when I looked at Dan Brubaker's example, because he gives us some other examples of variants. You know what we concealed and what he revealed in Surah 14, Ayah 38, in the Kyrene text, the one that we use today now. It's you know what we conceal and what we reveal. So from he, it's gone, from singular, it's gone to plural. Here's another example, chapter 3, verse 158. The Topkapi reads, if you should die or be slain, you shall not be gathered. In the Kyrene text that we use today, the Hafs text, if you should die or be slain before him, you shall undoubtedly be gathered. So again, that changes the meaning. Does it change the theology? We'll see. Now, this is something that I just received yesterday. Well, actually, 2 days ago. I'm off by one day. On October 6th, I was in touch with one of the leading scholars on the Topkapi manuscript, and I had a good talk with him. And he said, this is what he said. This manuscript originally had the entire Quran. However, some folios have now been lost. Folios, and he goes, the retroverso and the 6 up to 11 to 11 verso, these are folios, these are pages. These are not surahs, were written at least a century later, maybe much later. In fact, he's saying they could even go up into the 9th century. The parchment that contains the text Quran, chapter 5, verse 2 to 8, is completely missing and was replaced during the restoration process with a blank parchment. Many of the first folios of the manuscript are damaged and are not clear. And then he goes on, he says that the date that Al-Takulich gives, he thinks is much too early. That is much too early. He says it has nothing to do. He would not even put it at all in the 1st century. He compares the HS32 with other comparable manuscripts and made the case that it is not earlier than 747. That is the mid-8th century. So he puts it right back to 747 for the majority part of this being written. It was written in the second half of the 8th century and the beginning of the 9th century. So he says parts of this were written in the 9th century, which puts it back another 50 years. None of the 2,200 variants have a significant theological impact, but he says, but those are not the only variants. He's come across more than what Al-Takulich have, mainly because he's had more time to look at it. This is his area of his thesis. So you can see why he would find a lot more than what Al-Takulich did in just a cursory overview. Taking into account the type of these variants and the paleography of the manuscript, it can show that up to the 2nd century, that means up to 816, the Quranic text was still being edited. From what he's seen here, there was still editing going on all the way up into the 9th century. So that just came out 2 days ago. And this is why I love this work. We keep on coming up with newer and newer material, which is actually proving that these are later manuscripts, not earlier. Let's go to the Samarkand. The Samarkand is probably the second most important one, though, as far as Muslims are concerned. It was brought to Britain, I remember, a number of years ago when I was there in London. They had it on display. It's called a monumental text. You can see why. It's very large, has very large writing, which all by in itself shows you that it's a later manuscript, as Dr. François Doroche says in his work on the German work on the manuscript evidence. He talks about the fact that this was borrowed from the Christian manuscripts, and the Christians were using this kind of monumental text on their Greek manuscripts for the New Testament in the 8th and 9th century. So this could be even later and be the same as that. It's very unsophisticated, but the script does help date it. Now, according to Al-Takulich, what he says about the Samarkand, it is not Uthmanic, as it dates from the 8th century. It does not date from the 7th century at all. So he puts it almost 100 years later. And there are 6 reasons to discredit this manuscript. He said it has undisciplined spelling, it has different writing styles, it has scribal mistakes, it has copyist mistakes, it was written by someone with very little experience in Arabic, and it has later addition, and it only goes up to Surah 43. Remember, there's 114 surahs in the Quran. This is not even half the Quran. So you can see why he dispels. In fact, he says this is not a good manuscript to use because it has so many errors, and it is done by people who are just inept. of the 43 surahs that do exist, that are there, only one of them is complete. Only one of them is complete. That's Surah 6. 24 of the surahs are partial, and 18 just don't even exist. So even when you say 40, it goes up to 43 surahs. You're not talking. You've got to make sure and tell what we mean by those 43 surahs. So you can see it has an awful lot lacking in it. What about the Ma'il? Well, I have the Ma'il right here. And the Ma'il is one of my favorites because it's there housed in the British Library. And so we've had it for years. And I've been taking tours down there. Whenever I take a tour of the British Museum, we always go. And you can see it's I don't know if you can see it. Well, you can see it there on the picture better than what I'm holding up. But it is written in a slanted text. That means Ma'il. That's why it's called Ma'il, which means slanted in Arabic. There you can see a versification has been put in. There is no dots on above these words. There's no dots below the letters. There's no dama, kasra, fatha. So this shows that it's very early. It's a very crude text. You can tell it's not stylized like the Topkapi was stylized or the other ones that are Abbasid. You can see where there are parts of it that have been written and then added to at a later date. You can see right here, there's part that have been added at a later date. You can also see that here, it's even added to, another verse has been added to in a different color. Can you see that? So let me just put it up there so you can. And so you can see there has been some doctoring done of this manuscript over the ages, over the centuries. And that's why it's a fascinating script to do. I'm not doing any work on this. Thank goodness I don't have to do the German work. But it's fascinating that when you look at the Ma'il, there has been a disputation as to what the date is on it. The style of writing somewhat helps you to date it, but it again, like the Samarkand, it only goes up to Surah 43. What isn't that curious that they both stop up at Surah 43? Why is that? So only includes about 53% of the Quran. Now, Altakulich dates it to the early 8th century. Dr. Martin Links, who was curator for the library and had much more time to study this manuscript and is British himself. He was a Muslim convert. He dated it to the late 8th century, about 790. Altakulich puts it much earlier, about 60 to 70 years earlier there. So you can see there's a dispute amongst the experts. Who is the one that's correct? That has yet to be decided. And you can see the problem is, how can you date it? What can you date? You can't date the parchment, because the parchment, if you use radiocarbon dating, as we're going to see later, that just tells you when the animal died. It doesn't tell you when it was written. Let's go to the Al-Huzayni. The Al-Huzayni is the one that's there in Cairo. It's the one that you can see there pictured. It's also a monumental text, much like the Samarkand. Is it the Caliph's Quran? According to Altakulich and Ekmel and Asanulu, it is not. Altakulich says this of the Al-Huzayni: this is not Uthmanic. It is not from the 7th century. It is dated from the early to mid 8th century. So he puts it into the 8th century. It was stated that the Cairo copy might have been written on the order of Abd al-Aziz bin Marwan in 704, that the governor of Egypt. However, the reason for reaching this conclusion has not been explained. We share the view that this copy is not one of the Muslims attributed to Caliph Uthman. Now, François de Roche does not agree with Altakulich on this. François de Roche, who is the leading scholar in the West on the earliest manuscripts, he is at the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris there in France, and he is the one that controls the Petroponus, which we're going to talk about. He dates this manuscript to much later. He dates it to mid 8th century, maybe even later than that. He says that this is a monumental manuscript, and therefore they are much later. That's why they're so much bigger, probably the late 8th, maybe even up until the 9th century. And you can see those arrows are pointing to coverings where they're censoring the text. I'm going to be talking about this, so I'm not going to go into more when I talked about Dan Brubaker's material, because this is from Dan Brubaker's book. But take a look there. You can see 8 different coverings on one page. These coverings are censorship, and that's one of the difficulties. Though it's dated from the mid 8th century to the early 9th century, so much of it is too late to be relevant. Because this should really be in our discussion, because we're talking about almost a century to a century and a half after Uthman. 99% of it is complete, but it has no Fataha, which is the first chapter. And parts of Surah 2 are missing as well, possibly because it just was worn out. Who knows? It has enormous amount of coverings written over the text, which now correspond with the 1924 Hafstad, meaning that what they covered and what's left behind after they cover it now supports the the 1924 Hufs text that we use today. No one has researched, however, whether the existing realism, that the skeletal text, corresponds with the 1924 text. That has yet to be done. And that has yet to be done on almost all of these manuscripts. Alta Kulich and Ichmenidus did it on the Topkapi. That's the best they did. And that's why we have this book here. This is their finding. They did the most study because they are the ones that control this manuscript. It's in Topkapi Museum where they reside. That's why they have access to it much more so than the other manuscripts. But this new researcher is now showing that they didn't do that good a job, because we're finding that there's a lot more manuscript variants. But when you cover something like you have wholesale here in the Husseini manuscript, and then what is left behind now corresponds to the 1924, would you love to be able to pull up those covers and look underneath and see what they covered and why they covered it and how it would change the meaning, the text, even possibly the theology of the Quran. The Parasinium Metropolitanus, this one here, and this is the one, these are heavy, so forgive me if I don't hold them up too long. This is the Metropolitan. So you can see here, this is the one that's in Paris there. And it is enormous, very heavy. And as you can see, it also has that slanted text, much like the Matn that we saw earlier. And you can tell, if you look at the different pages, that they're written by different scribes. The style of writing is completely different, just between these two pages right here. I don't know if you can see that. Look there, and then look there. I should have maybe have pictures, and maybe next time what I'll do, I'll just take photographs, because that's just too heavy to hold. I'm not going to sit there and exhaust myself trying to keep these on and balance them at the same time speak. Now, it's a rudimentary script. Completely different script there. You can see the 2 pages right there. That's just 2 of the pages. I see this all the way through when you look at it. But again, the script does help to date it. François de Roche, who is the one that really controls this manuscript, is the one that's done the most research on it, says that there are corrections to the text. And he says that it disagrees with the 1924 Hufs text in 93 places. And it looks like it's been written by 5 different writers at 5 different times. It's later modified with erasers and additions. When you erase something and you add to it, you're destroying that which is there. And why would they erase and add? So that it now corresponds with the Hufs text that we use today. There are 3 big folios. The Arab 328 is only 26% of the Quran. So we're not talking about a huge text. It's just a very small part of the Quran. The Arab 330G is only 15% of the Quran, and the Arab 614 manuscript is only 4.2% of the Quran. So they're very small, nothing as large as what we're looking for. Here are some examples that Dr. Keith Small gave in the Petropolitanus, chapter 14, verse 37, and that's changed to so in the Kyrene text. So make hearts among the people inclined towards you. So there are some differences. Now, people say, well, that doesn't maybe make much of a difference, but Keith Small's comeback is, hold on a minute, if this is perfect and unchanged, you can't even have one word that is different. The difference is subtle, but it is different, because the repentance of the people is no longer a result of Abraham settling people near God's sacred house, as in the Petropolitanus manuscript, but instead the repentance is something Abraham is requesting of God as a result of his actions, such as according to the standard 1924 Hufs edition used today. So you can see, you can dispute that the fact that it's not that substantial until you unpack it. And you can see that when we're going to go and look at the Sana'a manuscript, because now we're actually going to go look at the Sana'a manuscript, and we're going to come to conclusions at it. Many scholars have dated it to around 705. Others have dated it to much later, and there are some that want to date it to even earlier. When you look at that picture on the left, there you can see, I don't have it here, I don't have the Sana'a manuscript, but when you look, those are from Dr. Garrett Quinn's facsimile that he has, the entire one. He was the one that was flown down in 1981 to look at it and to photograph it, and that's part of his photographs there. On the right side of the page there, where the yellow mark is Surah 19. Where the yellow mark is, it ends, that verse ends, that chapter ends, and it jumps to Surah 22. What happened to Surah 20 and 21? They're not there on the right side. Look on the left side of that picture on the left, and you'll see on the left side, Surah 20 begins, but it is a completely different script than what's on the right side, showing that it comes on much later, and this was added at a much later date. So here you can see the evolution in the text just by looking at the manuscript there. A lot more yet to be discovered about the Sana'a manuscript. Now, what you're looking at there is probably the oldest of all the manuscript. There you can see 2 pages, no dots, no vowels. But when they looked at it more carefully, they saw that it was a palimpsest. What do we mean by palimpsest? That means it was a text that was written on animal skin, was then washed off and then written over top. That's what that's what we know by a palimpsest. And this is a palimpsest. So that when you put it under ultraviolet light, like you see on the right there in the blue picture, you can see that there's a lower layer and there's an upper layer. The lower layer is the lighter text. The upper layer is the much more readable text. And the reason why is when they first washed these back in the 8th century, they thought that they had eradicated the text. What they didn't realize is that hundreds of years later, the ink would bleed through, and which it is doing now today. And that's why when you put it under ultraviolet light, you can actually separate the 2 scripts. According to some scholars, the lower text is dated to 671 to 705, and the upper text is dated to 705 and later. So parts of it are from the 7th century, the lower layer, and the parts is from the 8th century, the upper layer. Now, according to Karl-Heinz Oleg, who was with Gerrit Quinn when they did their survey back in the 1980s and later, he says the Quran began to be compiled in the last 2 decades of the 7th century. So he's talking about the time of Abdul Malik, the last 2 decades from 685 and on, with other versions continuing up until the 9th century. So he's talking about the other ones like Husseini manuscript. Dr. Gerrit Quinn continues, and he says, the oldest parchments and papers of any Quranic manuscript, this is, and yet more than half of the text is ambiguous letters which need diacritical marks for understanding. Adding vowels help correct mistakes. Changes in the orthography, conventional spelling system of the language are found in geographical traditional schools that he refers to. But it's fascinating when you look at the 2 layers, and this is what we want to do now. Let's look at those 2 layers and let's see what we're finding. There you can see the 2 layers. If you look carefully on the left, you can just barely see some of the letters bleeding through. Dr. Asma Hilali has written the only book so far that's been published, and this is it right here. You can see pictured there. This is known as the Sana palimpsest. She was just interviewed by Colin from Islamic Critique about a week and a half ago about her book. And I was listening to that interview, and she was very, she stood back from her own book. She pretty much said, I'm not an expert in this field. My area of study is hadith. And so my question was, why did she write a book on this if she's not an expert? And as I've now found out from another scholar who just phoned me last night, to talk about this, he says that really she is not the scholar. She should not have written this book because she made a lot of mistakes in this book. So I just need to say that before we get into her findings. Now, if you look at the upper and lower text, there you can see a graph that she put together of what exists in the lower text and what exists in the upper text. She found that there were 63 verses in the lower text, and within those 63 verses, there were 70 variants, which include verbs and nouns, articles different, participle differences, conjunction differences, preposition differences, isolated letters, expression differences, entire sentences. Some of the examples that we can look at. So when you look at the example list, I'm not going to give you all of them, just give you a few, just so you get a smattering. Here you have chapter 2, verse 88, where you have Allah curses them either for their injustice or their unbelief. So the significance of this is, does Allah curse you for your simply being bad or for unbelief? That's hugely important depending on, where the curse comes from and what's the reason for it. That would have a theological import. So you can see that would be damaging, theologically speaking, depending on which text you're looking at. The lower compared with the Hafs text. We're not looking at the upper and lower here. We're looking at the lower text variants compared with the Hafs text today. Here you have in chapter 8, verse 74, where it says you could struggle in jihad with their money themselves, or in the case of the text that we use today, did jihad struggle in the name of Allah only? Now, the significance between these 2 differences, do you carry out jihad with money or only in God's name? Again, that would change a practice. Here's chapter 9, verse 2. They do not escape Allah and his prophet, according to the Sana palimpsest, but know that you cannot escape Allah, nothing to do with his prophet there. So in the Sana manuscript, it talks about his prophet. In the Kyrie text that we use today, there is no prophet. So do they or you escape just Allah or his prophet as well? That would also have a theological difficulties. Here you're talking about mosques that are maintained by those. And are they maintained by those who just fear Allah, or are they maintained by those who also pray and give zakat? That's been added to the Kyrene text. Praying and giving zakat is not there in the Sana palimpsest. So you have another practice here that has been added in a later date, possibly at a later time. Certainly it's there in the current Quran. It's not there in the lower layer of the Sana'a manuscript. Here in chapter 9, verse 80, will Allah not forgive just the disobedient or those who don't believe in Muhammad as well? Seems that Sana'a forgot about Muhammad. They added Muhammad's name, just like the prayer and the zakat in the last instance. Here you have in the chain chapter, now Muhammad is added as a means to get forgiveness. In chapter 24, verse 27, seek welcome verses and greet those in them. So you can seek welcome as far as the Sana'a manuscript and when you visit somebody, but according to the Kyrene text, you must also greet them. So there is a practice that has been added that would have a change. Now, so you can see this does have differences in the practice, in the belief, and also the doctrine. Shabir Ali goes on and says there is no difference in belief, no difference in practice, and certainly no difference in doctrine. I've just shown you about 4 or 5 of them where there is difference in practice and belief and also in doctrine. And we could go on with the other 63 if we have more time, but we don't. The upper variants, there you can see the upper variants. This is the upper text, the 705 text, and later compared with the Hafs text. You can see there's quite a few variants there as well. Now, the conclusion, the lower text is dated to the late 7th century, and there's a 50-year gap between the 2 layers. This could suggest that the upper text is a later correction of the lower text. That's what Dr. Elizabeth Quinn, who's probably done the most research so far on it. Or one could question the dating of the lower text, since ink cannot be dated, only the skin of the animal can. So therefore, is it really that much earlier? There are variants in the upper text as well. This suggests that a standard text had not been canonized even in the early 8th century. The view that these texts are results of reading circles, that's Hilali's argument, that these are nothing more than students, is fallacious. Why? First of all, you do not give very expensive parchment to students. You don't do that. You give pieces of cardboard maybe, or you give chalk drawings, but you don't give parchment because they're hugely expensive. You would not waste them on students. Muslims wouldn't have preserved reading circle texts for 1400 years, but have thrown them away and would have certainly preserved the more important canonical texts from which they're derived. Another niggling problem, the biggest difficulty I see is this. These are the oldest Quranic fragments in existence date. This is the oldest manuscript that by most of the scholars claim, from 705 and later. All the other extant manuscripts are more recent. So why are these layered palimpsests the earliest ones? Where is the original Quran from which these supposed reading texts were derived, if they are reading texts? And finally, are these 2 palimpsest layers an example of the nascent Quran in its early formation, or are there either of these 2 layers parallel to the eternal tablets in heaven? Since there are so much difference from the Quran we are using today, then where is the original manuscript for the 1924 Hafs text used around the world? We're still waiting. Now, just some new information that's come in yesterday from a scholar who's now authority on this manuscript. And he just talked to me on the phone yesterday, and he says that the lower text is much more prolific than what Asma Hilali has found. She did not do a very authoritative job. But then she admitted in the interview just a week and a half ago that she is not a scholar in this area. So that's unfortunate. So far, this is the only published work we have to which to go on. He said that there are much more of the lower text and that it contains almost 11% of the Quran. Ooh, And he says, wait till you find out what we've now found in that lower text. It does not agree. And it has even more damaging variants than what she has put out. And he says that the lower text, he actually puts earlier than Uthman. In fact, he said the lower text could be even pre-Muhammad, pre-632. And he says this could be the text that is from Kufa, that is from Iraq. This could be Ibn Masud's text that all the traditions talk about. And remember, we talked about the Qur'an last week, and we talked about the fact that, and I just said it earlier today, that there are these other manuscripts there in Damascus and in Kufa, and also in Damascus, Kufa, and also in Basra that do not agree with the manuscript that was put together by Zayd ibn Thabit. Could be this lower layer be part of that manuscript, the Masud manuscript, because he said it follows what we now know about Masud's not closely, but it does follow in some cases. Could it be a nascent or another text that is from up north? Ooh, man, this is fun because everything we're finding is from up north. I just found this out yesterday. So The upper layer, he says, represents about 50%. So 50% for the upper layer. He's saying that the lower layer could be anywhere from 11 to 41% of the Quran. He's still now looking at all of it, and he's finding out an awful lot of text down there. Now, folks, this is exciting because this is happening as we speak. This is going on while we're talking. And that's why I say, hold on. We're going to find an awful lot more about these manuscripts that has yet to be published or yet to be uncovered. Now, he dates the upper layer to the mid-8th century, not to the early. He does not date to 705. He actually dates it to about the same time as the Topkapi, this one here, that is dated by the other scholar to around 747, so mid-8th century. Great stuff, exciting stuff. Now we get to the Birmingham Folio. The two Birmingham Folios that made such a big hoopla all over the world when the Times and also BBC and all these other people decided to go ahead and talk about it. Back in 2015, I don't know if any of you remember it. Some of you probably do. Back in 2015, BBC announced it on July 22nd of this oldest Quran that has now been found. It was found by accident there in Birmingham, in the Birmingham Library, in between another manuscript, the Mingana manuscript, which is much later. They found these two pages that did not correspond with the Mingana manuscript where they were found. And so they were sent immediately down to Oxford, where they were given radiocarbon dating. And the radiocarbon dating put it from 568 to 645. 568 to 645, Muhammad was born in 570, died in 632. The Quran was canonized in 652. So you can see it would cover the lifespan of Muhammad, and that's why it was all over the news. And Dr. David Thomas said this: the writer of this manuscript could well have known the Prophet Muhammad. He would have seen him probably. He would maybe have heard him preach. He may have known him personally. And that really is quite a thought to conjure with, he said. And remember this, he was so proud of this manuscript and went on and on about it. But folks, be careful. He does not understand Quranic manuscripts, and he does not know where this manuscript comes from. It's just two folios. And it includes parts of chapter 18, 19, and 20, or Surah 18, 19, and 20. Chapter 18, verse 17 to 31 of the seven sleepers of Ephesus. Interestingly, that story comes from Metaphrastus and Sarug, written in 521 AD. So that's an earlier story. Also, chapter 19, verse 91 to 98 comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is written in 145 AD, and the Pseudo-Gospel of Matthew, written in 600 AD. So both of those are earlier as well, especially the Proto-Evangelium. And then chapter 20, verses 1 to 40, is the story of Moses. What is most interesting is that when you look at these folios, that there are only 33 verses in both these two folios, front and back of two pages. Yet there are 6,236 verses in the Quran. So only 33 out of 6,000, and they're saying that this is a complete manuscript. See, when they made this pronouncement, this is the first Quran, the oldest Quran. No, it's only 33 verses from two folios. In fact, even those chapters, there are 343 verses in those three chapters. This is only 33 verses out of 343 verses. So it's not even the majority of the verses in those chapters that they represent. What happened to the rest of the other 300 verses? Why aren't they there, and why aren't they in the same sequence that we see here? Obviously, this is a truncated form of an earlier Quran. And if you notice, all the stories are outside of the Quran. They are outside of Muhammad. They are stories that took place in Ephesus with James, the Evangelium, also with the Pseudo. These are Gnostic writings. These are, as we've said over and over again, much of the Quran has been borrowed from other sources, all of them earlier. Hold that under your hat. Scholars disagree with the dates, or the Oxford Laugh gave. F.N. Rezvan, a Russian scholar who was at Birmingham University at that time in 2015, said this: the Birmingham fragments show several textual variants as well as verse numbering differences. The very early dating of these fragments before the reign of Uthman casts doubts on both the Islamic tradition. He said, hold on a minute. If the latest date that you can have, remember, you always go with the bell curve, you always go with the median date, not the earliest, not the latest, you go with that which is in the middle. And yet the latest date is 645. Uthman doesn't even create the Quran, the canonical Quran, until 652. So this would dispute that notion from tradition, Bukhari. The fact that the folios were kept for centuries in an iron box underground can partly explain the early radiocarbon dating. Parchment was an expensive material. Monastic and state scriptoria located in the territory of Greater Syria, way up in north, and Hira and Alexandria areas, look at that, Iraq and Egypt, could store this valuable material, including the donations of the pious laity. These stock became part of the loot captured by the Arabs in the first years of the conquest. So these were only finally captured by the Arabs from the Syria and Iraq and Egypt in the first years of the conquest, if you're following the Islamic tradition. And when did those conquests take place? Well, according to the Islamic traditions, they took place after Muhammad, long after Muhammad, during the time of Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And these captured leaves were then used for writing the Quran. Emilio Platti, a translator, says the Minyan of 1572 corresponds perfectly to the text of the Uthmanic Vulgate, pointing out the differences with the Sana'a Codex. Unquestionably the oldest manuscript, which therefore means that this Birmingham fragment is subsequent to the oldest manuscript, so therefore it would be past or after 705. Dr. Alba Fadeli cautions people on this. She's the one that found these folios and sent them down to Oxford to get them studied. And she says paleography gives an hypothesis. It is not exact, and carbon dating informs us only about the date the animal died. Be careful, do not put too much into carbon dating, she's saying. Burke, Suleiman Burke, who is assistant professor at Yalova University, Islamic Studies faculty there in Turkey, of the Islamic Art History Department, and collector Mehmet Kebi say this about the dates. The finding did not cause any excitement in me, he said. It is clear that the Quran pages, they have belonged to the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 8th century. We have seen many copies of the Quran written with that script in that era. The Turkish Islamic Art Museum, he says, even has the largest collection of such transcripts. It is clear that the Quranic pages at the Birmingham University and the ones that we have belong to the same era. So he puts it much later. Now, here's the problem with carbon dating, and this is the difficulty that is coming out. And this is, I'm borrowing now from this work that is done by Dr. Mark Dury called The Quran and Its Biblical Reflexes, pages 18 and 19. You need to read it, brilliant stuff. And what Dr. Mark Dury says, here's the difficulty. If you're going to talk about carbon dating of the Birmingham folios, you also need to talk about other carbon dating of other folios and other parchments. And so he questions the Birmingham folio. There it is there, and in green. I circled it in green. The Birmingham folio 568 to 645. According to the studies that have been done now on radiocarbon dating, let me just put and show you this. Look at the date for, now I've got it in blue there. That's actually the date that the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, 610 to 632, but his life is from 570 to 632. The Uthmanic Recension is 562. When they sent the Sana manuscript to the Lyon laboratory, they came up with these results. The one on the left, called Sana A, was 388 to 535. Muhammad was born in 570. The Sana B in Lyon was 433 to 599. Sana C was 543 to 643, and you can see Sana D and Sana E, the dates that are there. So looking at that, he said there is a problem here. What are you going to do with the one way on the left? It is so much earlier. Perhaps there's something wrong with the Lyon laboratory, and they found out that there was. Why? Because they took that same Sana example and they sent it to 3 other laboratories in Europe. One in Kiel, which is in Germany, and their dates for the Sana A was 410 to 460. Ooh, 460, that's 100 years before Muhammad. The one they sent to Zurich in Switzerland on the same sample, they dated it to 480 to 546. Again, long before Muhammad, long before the Quran, and long before Islam. And the one they sent to Oxford, the same laboratory that had originally done the Birmingham folio, the same laboratory that did that, their dates for the Sana'a manuscript was 505 to 550. Notice those dates from those 4 laboratories. Let's look at it again. There's the 4 dates of the 4 laboratories, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. All done in Europe. They are between 388 and 550. You take all 4 together, 388 and 550. Note the life of Muhammad, 570 to 632, right? If these dates are correct on the radiocarbon dating, they are 80 to 240 years too early, much too early. Note the Uthmanic Recension, when the Quran was finally canonized in 652. If these 4 laboratories are correct with the Sana manuscript, that would place them 100 to 260 years too early. And that's the problem with radiocarbon dating. You're not dating the ink. You're not dating when it was written. You're dating when the animal died, when the skin of the animal starts to deteriorate, and the radiocarbon starts to accumulate, and that's why you can just date that. And there's the difficulty. 4 of the dates are from 4 different laboratories, but date this manuscript page. And note that they are 95 probability ranges using the bell curve, so the highest probabilities are near the center of the bars and not the ends. So they would be the median dates, which would mean that even the one, the Birmingham folio, the median date is 610, which means it would be the time when Muhammad just began to receive his revelations, not after Muhammad's revelation, but it would be just at the beginning of his revelational period from 610 to 632. The Sana BC and D manuscripts were dated in Lyon, proving that there is a problem with the Lyon laboratory. They didn't have the same, they aren't getting the same dates. The Birmingham folios were dated in Oxford. All 4 Sana examples dated by 4 laboratories completely predate Muhammad, the Quran, and Islam. All the folios, including the Sana A, B, C, D, and Birmingham folios, except for E, predate the Uthmanic recension, proving that there's something seriously wrong with these datings or with the whole practice. Now, Mark Dewey says possibly there is the reason for these wrong dates or these early dates is that the sheep were eating a lot of seafood, which is older carbon. Maybe, hardly likely. Why would they be eating seafood? Or the standardization is incorrect. I think probably that. The parchment was being stored up for a long time before it was being used. Maybe they stored up for 200 years. The traditional dating of the Quran is wrong, and the Quran was created sometime around 450 to 500 AD, and the Muhammad story was attached to it much later. That's another possibility. He noticed that none of the really early manuscripts seem to have the verses referring to Muhammad in them. Those passages are missing in the earliest manuscripts. Is this a coincidence? Or could this be a combination of all of the above? Now, my solution is I agree with the graph that it is disturbing. There is possibly a problem with carbon dating due to its inaccuracies, so therefore I agree with Dury on that. Due to the expensive nature of the skins and the highly unlikely that these skins were stored for a long period of time, that I therefore I say no to point B. The traditional dating of the Quran is probably at fault because it comes from the 9th century, which is simply too late to be credible. Since Muhammad is not listed in the earliest dated folios, this suggests that the Quran is made up of borrowed material, which would naturally predate Muhammad and the Quran and the Islam. Look at those stories in chapter 18, 19, and 20. They are nothing to do with Muhammad. They are nothing to do with Islam. They are all earlier. Even if you want to say that those are correct datings, you probably are looking at manuscript from which the Quran was borrowed from. I won't go into the rest because I think it just repeats what we've already said. You can read that on your own. But here's my final conclusions. The ink has not been dated. Remember that. It's just the parchment. So this dates of 568 to 640 is only saying when the animal died. If the dates are correct, then the classical account is wrong, because the classical account says the Quran was not even created in its final form until 652. It may simply suggest that the 3 stories in the folios were borrowed from outside, usually simple stories. That's why they are so simple. These folios could be example of those earlier sources written in Arabic. Scholars like Rezvan, Plati, Fedeli, Burke, and Chebi do not agree with the early dates, so it's clear there is not a consensus within scholarship. The 4 laboratory reports in the Sana manuscript are dated between 390 to 550, so 80 to 220 years, much too early. Thus, they would all be pre-Islamic, pre-Muhammad, pre-Uthmanic, and pre-Quranic. Now, let's then go into Daniel's material. This is the Razm. These are the Razm corrections. This is the 4,000 early consonantal variants that he has now come up with. And this is probably, I think, on an academic level, by far the most damaging of all the material that is out there, is currently out there. On a popular level, the Qur'an material that we did last week is very damaging. You can see it's hugely damaging because of the claims Muslims make in the popular culture publicly. But on an academic level, this is by far the most damaging because it from an academic level, it confronts the whole ethos of what the Quran is or what the writings of the Quran are. Now, in his book that he came out with last year, 24th, 2019, he published this 2 hours before we got up on the ladder to introduce it there at Speaker's Corner. He found over 4,000 of these variants. He only shows 22 there. He says 20 on the front, but actually there's 22. These variants include insertions, erasers, coverings, and tapings. What do we mean? Well, there you can see some insertions. They're words that are put above the line. Here you can see erasers. These are removal and then overwriting. Sometimes an aleph is removed or intentionally. Now, here you have erasers overwritten where they've erased it and they've written over top of it. They haven't even bothered in some cases to erase it well, or they wrote it with a different colored ink. Here you have overwriting without erasers, either to restore a portion of the text that has faded with time or change the text entirely, as you can see in the lower example, or the selective coverings. And these are a mass censorship that is done by covering over the words or the sentences. And then sometimes they cover and then they write over top. And what they write over top now supports the Huff's text. And then you have tapings where they have block tapings. When he first looked at these, he thought that these were nothing more than there was damage done to the parchment. When we looked on the backside, there's no damage whatsoever. It's obviously that they are centering that text where the tape is. So without much further ado, I want to look at 16 examples just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. When you look at his book, he does 22. I'm just going to go with 16. And here's the first one in Surah 9, Ayah 72. Now, some of you have seen this before, so I'll go through much more quickly because this is also up on the internet. But when you look at these examples, take a look at the hua there. You can see it there where the green arrow is. It's written in a much finer nib. It's put between the lines. You can see it's much smaller than the original text. You can see it's been added at a different date. Hua means that is, has been added to the text. Why has been added? You don't need that is there. The reason why is because that is what the Huff's text has. It has that is there. So they brought it in line with the Huff's text. Here you have Lahum in chapter 42, verse 21 in the Bibliothèque Nationale. This is the Metropolitan manuscript. And you have Lahum. Originally it said for him, now it says to them. So it's been made from singular to plural. It's gone from to him up to them. Why has it been added to made it plural? Well, because that's what the Huff's text have. So it now corresponds with the Huff's text. And here's cases where he's added the name Allah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. 9 times where the name Allah has been found on the Fustat Umayyad Codex. 9 times, you can take a look, you can see it's put above the line. You can see it's in a different nib, it's a different color, it's done at a later date. And you don't need Allah in those, at least 8 of those, the ones that are circled in green, you don't need Allah at all. It's understood it's talking about God. Only in the yellow one you really need there to know who the subject is. So why was Allah added? Why did they put Allah there above the line, or squeezed in between letters, or trying to push it over top of other words? The reason why is because those Allahs are found in the 1924 Huff's text, the one that we use today, this text. Since they're here, they have to be there as well. And so they're bringing it to standardization. Here you have in the National Library of Russia, Marcel, here you have in chapter 30, verse 9, where an erasure between the words Akibatu, the fate, and Aladina of those. Now, we don't know what word it was there to begin with because it's been erased. It looks like it was between 4 to 6 letters. Could be, according to Dan, Kulu min Alav, or Katidan min most of, or it could have been Al-Yahud, the Jews, or Al-Nas, the people. Nonetheless, the reason why it has been erased is now it corresponds with the Huff's text. Here you have 4 corrections. This is the one that's on the cover of his book that you see here. And look at, I'm just looking at number 1, number 2, number 3. Number 1, you'll see the word alayhi, against him, over there, has been written over an eraser in chapter 6, verse 93. And then the word that should be there, which is number 2, the arrows point to, Allah, about Allah, has been written in the margin. It should be where Allahi is, and they've left Allahi there, put it back in again, and then they just wrote it in the margin. They're not even concerned with whether or not people see that this is a correction. Actually, these are 2 corrections. Look at number 3 there on the left side. The word Aladina, whom, has been inserted where it was first omitted. And then at the bottom, number 4, the word Ya'lamun, they know, has been written over an eraser. And it could be, we don't know what the word is, but in every case, what you see here, except for the number 1, it now corresponds with the 1924 Huff's text. Here you have multiple post-production. You can see entire line has been added in between the spaces of 2 other lines. And possibly this was a copyist error. Maybe it was rewritten into the text later on. What we do know is, if you look at number 2, asanu, do good, was omitted when it was first written, and it was later added, but in red ink. So this is obviously an error, or it was different than from what the Huff's text. Now that it's there, it now supports the Huff's text. Here you have the word al-sabi, the 7, has been added above the line. Say, who is the Lord of the 7 heavens and the Lord of the great throne? In the Huff's text, it is there, and so that's why they had to put it into this one, because it is in the text that is now the official text. Here you have bimithli. Now you can see very clearly that this was added at a later date. Why? Well, take a look. It has dots above the and below line, has b for the dot below it, and also has vowels, the kasra and the fatha. So you can see that this had to be added at a later date, squashed in between the letters there. Interestingly, by adding it there, they actually made it a grammatical mistake, because they have 2 B's there. They should have got rid of one of the B's, or just not added the second B. And that's why, though it now supports the Huff's text, they've done themselves a disfavor by actually, in this case, putting in too many B's. Now, here's the Topkap. Remember I said there are some examples of the Topkap where there are other variants. Here's another example of that, where there's an insertion in chapter 66, verse 8 of lam lam he. It used to say, "Oh, you who believe, turn to a sincere repentance." Now it says, "Oh, you believe, turn to Allah with sincere repentance." Now, the original aleph, after the ilah, uses a larger nib. You can see that, suggesting an error in the original text. The change has been made with a very small nib, and it's probably a modern intervention. It now supports the Huff's 1924 text. Here you have, in chapter 3, verse 171 of the Petropolitanus manuscript, an eraser overwritten the word bounty, fadlin. The dadlam of the fadlin, bounty, has been written over an eraser. Again, why? Well, you can see it now supports the Huff's text. Well, they've kept the other words underneath quite clear there, probably 5 to 11 original words, but that did not support the text. Now, here you have 2 different manuscripts, one from the one in Russia and the other one from the one in Paris. And the upper one, you can see the kala has been changed to kalu, so it's been made from singular to plural, from say, imperative, to, or he said, now to they said. And the same thing has been done in the exact same verse, chapter 34, verse 35, in a completely different manuscript, the Petropolitanus, in the lower example, from kala to kalu, they said. Why? And in both cases, they changed both the Russian text and the French text, where they're housed, to correspond with the 1924 Huff's text. Here you have erasers leaving gaps in the Topkapi. Here again, looking back at the Topkapi in chapter 4, it used to say the way of Allah. Now it says, though surely those who disbelieve in him are from the way have strayed. They've just taken Allah out of there. Why? And the reason they've erased it is because it now corresponds with the Huff's text. Here in chapter 24, verse 33, in the Doha manuscript, you can see that there is an eraser in the green arrow, and then continues with the blue arrow. So it continues on what? That's a line below it, and it occurs between the words fadlihi, the grace, and before wa aladina, those who. Now, we don't know what they erased. There's no way to know what they got rid of, but what has been retained now corresponds with the Huff's 1924 text. And here's an eraser overwritten of an entire line in chapter 8, verse 3 of the Doha manuscript. That now supports the Huff's text. And I showed you this one earlier, and here's another example of here. You have 8 different coverings. What's left over almost just looks like chicken scratches. It's almost impossible to read, though you can still read it. And what Dan Brubaker says is that what is left behind after they covered it 8 different times now supports the Huff's text. That's censorship on a whole scale. And so you can see that's on a massive scale. In chapter 13, verse 11 to 12, in both these 2 cases, this is the Husseini manuscript. I talked about the coverings already. Here's some examples of it. Here is an example where in the one up above, the 2 letters, bi anfusihim, in themselves, has been written on top of a taping. So they've taped it and they've written that over. In the bottom one, you can see that even the script is limited. It's been elongated. This is a much more stylized script. So they've covered it over with 2 coverings and then added these words, and hope, wa tama, tama'a. And they've added that so that it corresponds with the 1924 Huff's text. So obviously there was a lot more written there. They had to elongate it to accommodate the space that they had to try to fill. So those are 16 examples of the 22 he has in his book. Now we get into another whole problem, and this is the difficulty of when did the Quran, when was it complete? And Muslims don't know how to answer this one. And the reason why is because there has not been a critical edition of the Quran ever done. François Doros says this in his quote. He says, when the Al-Azhar specialist, that's Muhammad ibn Ali al-Husayni al-Haddad, the specialist, convened to produce a reliable edition of the Quran towards the 1920s, he means 1924, they never thought of looking for the earliest written witnesses. Had they known how to identify them, but used in the course of their work the specialized literature on the Qur'an. In other words, the whole problem with the Qur'an, they looked at the Qur'an that we talked about last week, or the orthography which developed the Muslim scholarly circles from the 8th century onwards, 8th, 9th, and 10th century. They used basically the Qur'an to decide which was the one they were going to choose. So they never even looked inside any of these Qur'an. They didn't look at any of the words. They didn't look at any of the sentences. That is what you do when you do a textual edition of the Quran. When you look and try to find what the earliest edition is, what's the earliest manuscript, what's the original Quran. They didn't do anything like that when they chose this book here in 1924. Muhammad Ali al-Husayni al-Haddad should have looked for the earliest manuscript. First of all, he should have tried to look and date the earliest manuscript. He did nothing of the sort. And use that one, if he did, one or no, multiplicity of them, as the model or the paradigm. And then any other subsequent manuscript which he found, put them in chronological order, and then compare it with the original. That's what we do with the biblical manuscripts. But how did he choose the Hafs text? He didn't do any of that. I don't even think he looked at one word or one sentence. We don't know of him doing that because there's nothing there written about how he chose it, except we do know how he did. He didn't open a page, did not compare it with any of the earlier manuscripts. Remember, any of these 6 manuscripts, he could have compared it with them. He didn't. He didn't even compare it with the 29 other Qur'an versions, which he threw out. He didn't look at any of them. He didn't do any comparison between the 29 and the 1. He just took the 29 and dumped them into the Nile. He chose the Hafs because the Ottomans had chosen it. And he was still under their jurisdiction theologically because they were still in power theologically, not politically, but in power theologically. And that's why, since they liked it, he liked it. And why did they choose it? Well, we understand the reason they chose it is because it was from Kufa, close to them, and because it was easy to read. That's it, folks. That was the reason that this book was chosen. Oh dear, this is not how you do any critical analysis of a text. Look at the biblical manuscripts we have. Take a look at the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus. Those are the 2 earliest complete metropolitan codices. They became the model for all other manuscripts because before these were discovered in the 1800s, they only had the Latin Vulgate, and Latin Vulgate doesn't agree with many of the Greek texts, and that's why we then now go back to the earlier Greek texts, but they're not originals. They're from the 4th century. The Alexandrinus that's on the right there is from the 5th century. It's also in the British Library. So those are the 3 metropolitan codices. By knowing what they say, by opening up, reading them, comparing them together, we now pretty much know 99.9% of the biblical text. That's why you need to do a critical textual analysis of the Quran, already done in the Bible. Now, about a year ago, well, a little over a year ago, in June of last year, I was there on the ladder to introduce this book. This is 2 hours after it had been published on May 26. And while we were on the ladder there, Mansour Ahmed, the guy on the right, I'm not going to show you the video because it would take too long, but it takes about a half an hour, but you can go and see it on Fander Films. He gets up on the ladder, and he is the one that really should have taken us on because he is part of the Islamic Awareness website. He is in charge of the manuscripts for the Islamic Awareness website. So he is considered to be one of the leading scholars on the Islamic Awareness website. And so that's why it's very important that we did use him, and it's very important that he did come up and confront us. And he spent about a half an hour trying to dispute these variants, trying to say they're nothing more than copyist errors. That's all he could come up with. But then he says we can know that there is a continual textual tradition of the complete Quran all the way back to the time of Uthman. He first said Muhammad, and then he quickly changed it when I turned on him on that. He said, well, to the time of Uthman, to 652. So he said that, and it's right there on the video. You can watch it. 20 different cameras where they're picking this up. A complete textual tradition from today all the way back to the time of Uthman. So I turned on him and said, oh, great. So show me, where is this textual tradition? Show me where this manuscript are that you're talking about that even exists at the time of Uthman. Where is it? Show me one. And he went quiet. He didn't answer. So I said, well, how about the 7th century up until 699? Is there any? And he wouldn't answer. And then I said, well, then how about the 8th century? And then finally he turned on me and he says, Jay, you're not listening to me. I said, by the 1st century AH. Well, he didn't say that earlier. He said back to Uthman, because the 1st century AH goes from 622 up till 719. So he did not say that initially. He quickly changed it when he realized that he was being filmed. I said, okay, let's go to 719. I gave him 2 extra years. I said 721. Can you show me any complete Quran, 114 surahs, that is before 721? And he said at that time, we have 97% of the Quran. What is he talking about? He's talking about this here. This is up on the Islamic Awareness website. He's probably the one that's responsible for putting it up there. And he looks at the accumulative number of surahs of the Quran up until 719, up until the 1st century. And when you add them all up, all the surahs from all the manuscripts that they claim are before 719, you get 96% of the Quran, not 97, as he said on the latter, 96. So within the first 100 years after Muhammad, now if that's the case, that's 732, but he's saying 719, that they can find 96% of the Quran. How did they get to that figure? What is he talking about? You need to look at their website. When you go up on their website, this is the graph they put. This is how they get to the 96% of the Quran. They are looking at 63 manuscripts, they call them. Manuscripts. There they all listed there. You can see them all on the left side. And look at all the parts in red. That's how much of the Quran each one of those manuscripts are contained. The best is the one at the very top. That's a manuscript 2165. That's the Ma'il manuscript. That's this one right here that I have right here. This one. This is the Ma'il that they're saying is 22% of the Quran. That's the best they've got. And they're dating that one before 719. But can you see? Look at most of them are just little fragments. These are 63 fragments. There may be an ayah here, an ayah there, a verse here, a verse there. That's all you're talking about. And the bigger ones are not even half of the Quran. The biggest one, the Ma'il, the one I just showed you, takes up and gives the really half, 50% of the Quran comes from just one manuscript, the very first one, which they all date before 719. Now, here's where I want to dispel that. I want to look and ask that. Are any of them before? What we have now found, and we've done a study on this, we've been looking at it, what we now have found is that 20 of them, these 20 that are in green arrows that I'm putting up on the screen right now, they are tentatively dated, but there are disagreement with scholars. No one has come to any conclusion on any of these manuscripts. So where did Mansur Ahmad suddenly know that all of these are before 719 when none of these 20 have any consensus yet? 9 of them, these 9 that I'm putting up in blue here, these are all after 719. These are well substantiated, including the first one, the most important one, the Ma'il, the 2165, that is 50% of the Quran. That is absolutely after 719. It's long after 719. It's probably, in fact, it's more like the halfway through the century. So that one you cannot use. Certainly you cannot use that one, and nor the other 8. And then the other 34, we have no way of knowing because no one's done any work on them. These 34 that you see going up in the red arrow there, no one has really done any work. There's no consensus at all on any of them to know what the dates are. So they just grabbed them, put them up there because they looked at them and they said, here's this verse, here's this verse, let's just put it up and let's just all claim that they're all before 719. That's how they've come to their conclusion. That's how they've come to their conclusion, folks. Let's just review this. So 20 of them are tentative. 9 of them are all after 719. And the other 34, no one has any way of knowing. We have no way of knowing because no one has done any work on them. It's nothing more than speculation. Thus, none of them are really valid. All of them are either later or tentatively dated or have no supporting evidence at all. And this is the lie that Islam is putting out. This is on their website, and this is the best they have got. They can only come up with 63 of these fragments, as you see there, these 63 fragments, yet there is none of them are complete. Not one of them is a complete Quran. Within 100 years of Muhammad, the Muslims have collected these 63 fragments, claiming that there's 96% before 719, yet almost all of them are either tentative or have no supporting evidence for any early dates. Some of their dates are even go up to the 9th and 10th century. They have not carried out any textual critical analysis on any of these fragments. They don't even know if they agree with the Huff's text. So the claims they make are nothing more than lies, folks, and we need to point that out. And this is why Muslims have for generations now made claim after claim after claim, because nobody's held them accountable to their claims, because nobody knows whether or not these are correct. Everybody just assumes they must know what they're talking about, yet there has been hardly any work done on any of these manuscripts. And the dates they're giving are not correct. And certainly, if they are, they're nothing more than tentative dates. Okay? Make sure that when Muslims make this claim, that you can shut it down very quickly just by showing these graphs. Now, let's go to our final conclusion. When all said and done, we looked at 6 different areas. The 2 compilations of the Quran, the 6 earliest Quranic manuscripts, the 2 layers of the Solid palimpsest, the 2 Birmingham folios, radiocarbon dating and debunked it, the 4,000 early consonantal variants, and the 63 earlier extant fragments. And what have we found? Our source for the Quran compilation is 200 to 300 years too late, therefore is worthless. Al-Bukhari is simply too late. We cannot use Al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509, and 510. We found errors even within what he's saying concerning the whole thing with the dialectical difficulties and how you can read dialectical differences between a Qurayshi and other dialects within the 7th century if you don't have dots and vowels. The 2 compilations, 20 years apart, prove that men changed even the earliest Qurans. The 6 manuscripts that we looked at today were not analyzed textually, nor dated correctly, and there is not one of them that is original. They are not, any of them are from the time of Uthman. So therefore, the 6 manuscripts that we did look at, the best they have got are those 6 manuscripts. They are not complete, they are not the same, they are not early, and all of them are either from the 8th or 9th, some possibly even to the 10th century. The 2 layers of the Sanaf manuscript prove that men created a nascent Quran in the 7th century, did not like it, so washed it off, and subsequently rewrote over top of it. The Birmingham folios are certainly not early like they claim, but part of the later Petropolitan manuscript. This is the newest stuff that's just come out. Dr. François de Roche says that those 2 folios of chapter 18, 19, 20 do not belong to the Mingana manuscript. They belong to his Petropolitan manuscript, which is this one right here. They belong to this manuscript because this one is missing, chapter 18, 19, and 20. And what's more, those are the ones that are the same. They looked exactly the same that you find here. It's the same script, the same penmanship. That's why he's saying they actually belong to my manuscript. And his Petropolitan manuscript is the mid-8th century. The 4 carbon-dated lab reports prove that radiocarbon 14 is much too inexact, and that men borrowed stories created long before the Quran, if they are correct. The 4,000 consonantal variants prove that Muslims have been and are possibly still changing and standardizing the text of the Quran. The 63 fragments employed to find just 90% of the Quran proves that there was no Quran for the first 100 years, while every one of the fragments they have found are either tentative or quite late, or they have no sources whatsoever to support them, suggesting that little is known about these manuscripts, and they are not even manuscripts. They're nothing more than fragments. The best is this one here, the Ma'il. The 2 compilations, along with the 6 different manuscripts, along with the changed palimpsest and the 4,000 consonantal variants, as well as the 63 supposed early fragments, prove that when Muslims find problems with their Quran, they either burn them or wash them or erase them or cover them or sink them in the Nile to destroy the evidence, or now delete them off the internet. Delete them off their internet, or decide to go home and no longer take any public socializing, because there's no way you can defend the claims they are making. Finally, from what we have researched and found, we can say the Quran was not created by God at all. The Quran was not sent down to Muhammad between 610 and 632. The Quran was not completed by Uthman in 652, not from the manuscript evidence we're looking at. The Quran was changed in the last 1,300 years. Notice I use the number 13, not 14, because I don't even think the Quran came into existence as in any manuscript form until the 8th century. The Quran was finally compiled in 1924 and made official in 1985, folks. It was made official by King Fahd in 1985 because of the success of what he saw happening there in Egypt in 1924 and 1936. So their Quran is really only 96 years old. Wait a minute, 35 years old if you look at King Fahd's official, making it official. So, which means many of us who are watching this in this room are actually older than the Quran. So we can end with that. However, by casting doubt on the Quran, our Muslim friends can consider a much better book, this one here, the Bible. See, every one of these tests that we've made, the manuscript evidence, looking at the translations, looking at the lectionaries, looking at all the early church fathers' quotations, we do not have this problem with the Bible that they have with the Quran. I'm so glad to be able to support the Bible, to know that all of this has been done by us. We've done it in the last 100 years. We've come to conclusions. Now, for the first time, the manuscript critical analysis, the textual critical analysis done to the Bible is now being done to the Quran. And you can see in the last 2 hours what we have found with it. Okay, that should be the end of this talk. Come back with me if any questions you do have. This is going to be good fun. So let's now open it to questions. And then finally, Marie asks this: I have seen videos of people leaving Islam due to what is now revealed about the manuscripts, even scholars burning their books. So if Yasser Qadhi and scholars know there are issues with the text, how can they continue to believe? Or do you think maybe many are continuing on their career path? I think what you're finding here, Marie, is that these scholars do know this. They're aware of this. They're very aware of the fact that they cannot make these public pronouncements anymore. Yasser Qadhi lives in the West. He comes from Houston. He lives in academia. He has to continue to keep his credentials in academia. Therefore, he is pulling now back out of public discourse. And what he means by that, he's pulling out of things like YouTube and places like that, which are not really in academia. He's pulling back from the social public discourse, which is probably smart on his part, because he knows that he cannot continue to get into interviews like he got into there on June 8th. He cannot continue to make the claims that he knows are true in public anymore, because he's going to be vilified. And not only is he going to be vilified, hundreds are leaving Islam. It's not just hundreds are leaving Islam. I'm getting emails and I'm getting texts from people who are leaving Islam because of the Qur'an problem. Because on a popular level, that destroys everything they know about the Quran. That destroys any notion that it's been preserved. It destroys any notion that there's only one Quran. It destroys any notion that this Quran exists in heaven. It destroys any notion that Muhammad received one Quran, or that Uthman finally canonized it in 652. It wipes all of that out. And it shows that the Qurans are man-made, and that they all start to appear in the 8th, 9th, up until the 10th century, and then were canonized, not just in the 10th century, not just in the 14th century, but not until the 15th century, and then finally recanonized again in the last century, in the 20th century. So can you see why Muslims are leaving? How do you then support this notion? How do you support a Quran that has this many problems, this many errors, on this many levels, over this much time, by so many scholars who can no longer even support it, will not even debate it, and therefore kept on saying, don't ask me this question, take my class, come into my class, and I'll explain it there. When he then goes on and says the 3 different gradations of what he means by that the first gradation, they don't say anything to people who are new converts. To those who have been in Islam for a while, they then go into it, but they say they don't give them any answers. They just, there's a red line. You don't ask beyond this red line. And to those who dive deep, to take a deep dive, he said, those who come part of my class, we will get into it, but I'll give you all the answers. I'll show you how to answer it. And how was his answer? What, right there in 25 minutes? After 25 minutes of an asking by Muhammad Hijab, what's your answer? He finally said, they're all the Quran. And that's his answer. And that's the best he's got in 25 years. No wonder Muslims are leaving, because now we're finding that this book is nothing more than a man-made book. And that's all we need to prove. All we need to prove, those of us who are watching, those of you who are doing this work with Muslims, all you need to prove is that this book does not come from God. It does not come from Muhammad. It does not even come from Uthman. It comes from men. Men like you and me, weak men like you and me, humble men like you and me, who have changed it, manipulated, accreted it, deleted it, corrupted it, added, erased it, sometimes covered it, burned it, washed it, and then finally came up with the one Quran that they thought would finally solve all those problems, and they threw all the rest into the river. This is it, folks. This is the only Quran they got. Oh my, it's so easy now. We never had this kind of material 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Do you see how lucky you all are? And that's why I think we're going to see not just tens of Muslims coming and leaving Islam. We're going to see hundreds, but not just hundreds, probably millions. And we need to bring them home, because it's no good destroying the Quran if you're not going to provide the Bible. Make sure that you take them from this book to this book. Bring them home, folks. Bring them home. Make sure you destroy this book, yes, using historical criticism, using neutral criticism, using the criticism that are available to us, the very same criticisms that were applied to this Bible. Use this. This is what we're doing. This is redacted criticism. This is source criticism. This is textual criticism that we've been using today. Use it. But don't just destroy it. apply the same criticism of the Bible and say that we have passed every one of these tests. Just come on home, Muslims. Come on home. Come on home. The Bible's waiting for you. God bless you. Listen, we've gone way over 2 hours. This has gone 3 hours, folks. This is the longest lecture yet. It's my favorite. That's probably why. And I'll leave it there, and we'll see you next week, our final week. This will be the last week, and we'll actually ask the other $1 million question: where is Islam in the 7th century? Where can we find Islam? And I'll be bringing in some of Mel's material, some of Murad's material, a new guy named Joe. I'll be talking about Gibson's, and I'll be talking about Al-Jalad. I'll be talking about Duri's book. We're going to be talking about lots of different things to try to put it together. And we're going to end off with really the biggest bag, and that is we can pretty much debunk Islam in the 7th century. There just is not the Islam of the traditions, not the Muhammad of the traditions, not Mecca of the traditions, not the Qur'an of the traditions. We're going to find it's a completely different religion, a completely different book, a completely different man, a completely different place. The book, the man, the place. We're going to debunk it all next week. We'll see you in a week, folks. God bless you. It's been good being with you.